A missing dog, a mysterious key, and an interrupted wedding. Amid secrets and conspiracies, an unbreakable bond can change the fate of an entire family. Emily Thompson woke up startled that Saturday morning, her heart beating irregularly as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the silk curtains of her bedroom in the family mansion in Charleston. Something was wrong. She could feel it. It was her wedding day, the most anticipated event of the year in New York's high society, but an inexplicable unease had taken hold of her. She sat up in the king-sized bed and instinctively looked for Max, her loyal four-legged companion who always slept at the foot of her bed. The golden Labrador, a gift from her parents on her 10th birthday, wasn't there. She frowned, trying to remember if she had left the dog in the garden the night before, but she was certain she hadn't. "Max!" she called, her voice echoing through the empty room. No response, no familiar sound of paws tapping against the marble floor. The sound of knocking interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Emily, may I come in?" The voice of Margaret, the housekeeper who had been with the mansion for over 2 decades, sounded cheerful from the other side. "Come in, Margaret," Emily replied, trying to mask the concern in her voice. Margaret entered the room carrying an elaborate breakfast tray, her brown eyes sparkling with excitement. "The big day is here. How are you feeling?" She paused as she noticed the worried expression on Emily's face. "Is something wrong?" "Max is gone," Emily answered, getting out of bed and walking to the window overlooking the mansion's immaculate gardens. "He always sleeps here in the room, you know that, and today, of all days." "Calm down, my dear." Margaret set the tray on the coffee table and approached Emily, placing her hands on her shoulders with maternal care. "He must be wandering around the gardens. You know how clever Max is. He's probably sniffing something interesting out there." Emily nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this disappearance. Max was her last true connection to her parents, who had passed away so abruptly 5 years ago. Since then, the dog had become even more protective, rarely straying far from her side. "I'll ask the gardeners to look for him," Margaret said, trying to reassure her. "Now you need to focus on the preparations. The hairstylists and makeup artists will be here in an hour, and your Aunt Helen has already called 3 times wanting to know if everything is under control." Emily forced a smile, trying to cheer herself up. After all, it was her wedding to Alexander Montgomery, heir to one of New York's most traditional families. The union represented not only the merging of 2 powerful families, but also the final consolidation of the business deals her Uncle Albert had been working on for the past few years. While Margaret opened the curtains and arranged the wedding dress that would arrive soon, Emily picked up her phone and called Alexander. After 3 rings, the deep voice of the groom sounded on the other end of the line. "Good morning, my love." "Nervous?" he asked with that calm tone that always soothed her. "A little," she replied hesitantly. "Alex, Max is missing. I know it might seem silly to worry about this today, but—" "Emily," he gently interrupted, "if this is bothering you, I'll ask some of the event security to help with the search. I don't want to see my bride worried on our big day." His words were perfect as always, but something in his tone sounded different. Or was it just her imagination playing tricks due to wedding nerves? The morning flew by with hair trials, makeup touch-ups, and dozens of people coming in and out of the room. Emily tried to focus on the preparations, but her thoughts kept returning to Max. The searches through the gardens and neighboring properties had yielded no results. When the wedding dress was finally put on, an exclusive creation of French lace and silk, Emily looked at herself in the mirror. The image she saw was straight out of a fairy tale. The dress perfectly outlined her silhouette. Her light brown hair was styled in an elaborate updo with small natural flowers, and the makeup highlighted her delicate features. But her green eyes, so much like her mother's, reflected a restlessness that no amount of luxury could disguise. "You look beautiful," said her Uncle Albert, entering the room after a light knock on the door. Tall and elegant in his Italian tuxedo, he smiled with pride. "Your parents would be amazed." The mention of her parents made her heart ache. Albert had taken over her guardianship and the management of the family businesses after the accident, and Emily knew she should be grateful for all his support. Still, there were moments when she missed the way her father had run the business, always prioritizing people over profits. "Thank you, Uncle," she replied, forcing a smile. "Any news about Max?" Albert's smile faltered for an almost imperceptible moment. "Don't worry about that now, dear. I'm sure he'll show up. What matters is that in a few hours you'll be Mrs. Montgomery, and our dreams will finally come true." Our dreams, she thought. Since when had her dreams become so intertwined with her uncle's plans? The question echoed in her mind as the limousine drove through the historic streets of Charleston toward St. Peter's Cathedral. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Tell us which city you're watching from and we'll continue. St. Peter's Cathedral was breathtaking. Arrangements of white orchids and roses adorned each pew, and a red carpet stretched down the central aisle to the altar. Hundreds of guests filled their seats, murmuring in anticipation as they awaited the bride's entrance. At the altar, Alexander Montgomery discreetly adjusted his bow tie, occasionally exchanging nervous glances with his brother Edward, who served as his best man. Beside him, Albert smiled confidently at the most important guests, businessmen, politicians, and prominent figures of New York society. The music began to play, and the grand doors of the cathedral opened. Emily took a deep breath, lightly squeezing her uncle's arm before starting her walk. Photographers positioned themselves strategically, capturing every moment of what promised to be the wedding of the year. And then it happened. A familiar bark echoed through the cathedral, followed by the sound of paws running across the marble floor. Guests turned, some gasping in surprise, others murmuring in disapproval. Max, his golden fur dirty with mud, ran toward Emily, knocking over some floral arrangements along the way. "Max!" Emily exclaimed, momentarily forgetting all protocol. The Labrador stopped in front of her, panting, his intelligent eyes fixed on hers. It was then that she noticed there was something attached to his collar. Without a second thought, Emily bent down, ignoring her uncle's whispered protests. Attached to Max's collar was an old metal key, its tarnished surface contrasting with the shine of the dog's ID tag. "Emily," Albert whispered urgently, "this isn't the time. The guests are waiting." But Emily barely heard him. That key, there was something familiar about it, something that stirred distant memories from her childhood. With trembling fingers, she untied it from the collar and, following an impulse she couldn't explain, hid it inside her bouquet. "It's fine," she said, more to herself than to anyone else, and resumed her walk to the altar. Alexander maintained a fixed smile, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. Edward, on the other hand, seemed strangely unsettled, avoiding direct eye contact with her. The ceremony continued like a hazy dream. Emily repeated her vows mechanically, her mind constantly returning to the key hidden among the flowers. The priest's words sounded distant, as if coming from another world. During the exchange of rings, she noticed something she had never seen before. Alexander's hands were trembling. It wasn't the natural tremor of a nervous groom, but something deeper, more unsettling. When their eyes met, she saw something in his gaze that made her shiver. Guilt. As they exited the church, amidst hugs and congratulations, Emily scanned the crowd for Max, but the dog had disappeared once again. Albert supervised the photo session with military efficiency, ensuring that all the important moments were captured, with the right guests. "Are you okay?" Margaret asked discreetly, taking advantage of a moment when they were alone. "I've never seen Max act like that before." "Something's wrong, Lou," Emily whispered, touching the bouquet where the key was. "Hidden. This key. I think I've seen it before, but I can't remember where." Margaret frowned, her eyes revealing a concern that went beyond the incident at the church. "On the way to the reception, I need to tell you something," she said, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "About your parents' estate." Emily's heart raced. The estate was a secluded property where her parents used to spend weekends, a place filled with happy memories that had been practically abandoned after their passing. In recent years, Albert had insisted that the place brought back too many painful memories and should be sold. "Mrs. Montgomery," one of the photographers called, interrupting the conversation, "can we take some photos with your uncle and the groom's parents?" Emily nodded automatically, casting a meaningful last glance at Margaret. The housekeeper responded with a subtle nod. They would continue that conversation later. During the photos, Emily observed the interactions around her with new eyes. She noticed how Albert and Alexander's father were whispering tensely between clicks. She saw Edward drinking more champagne than usual, his face growing increasingly troubled. And Alexander. Alexander alternated between moments of exaggerated affection and periods of deep distraction, as if he were fighting an internal battle. The key in her bouquet seemed to burn, a weight that went far beyond its physical size. Emily was certain that this object held important secrets, secrets that someone, or several people, preferred to remain buried. When they finally entered the limousine to head to the reception at the mansion, Emily took advantage of a moment when Alexander was distracted, talking on the phone, to examine the key more closely. It was old, probably from an antique piece of furniture, with a peculiar design at its tip. A design that vaguely resembled the symbol her father used on his most important personal documents. "Ready for the party?" Alexander asked, hanging up the phone and turning his attention back to her. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Almost," Emily replied, quickly hiding the key. "I just need to take care of one thing first." And she knew exactly who she needed to talk to first. Margaret, the only person who knew every corner of the estate, every secret that place held. The Thompson mansion was magnificently decorated for the reception. Crystal chandeliers reflected the golden light of the evening, while arrangements of white flowers perfumed the air. Guests circulated through the main hall, champagne glasses in hand, commenting on the ceremony and the unusual incident with Max. Emily managed to escape for a few minutes, using the excuse of wanting to touch up her makeup. In reality, she had arranged a discreet meeting with Margaret in her old playroom, now transformed into a reading room on the second floor of the mansion. "Lou, tell me what you know about the estate," Emily asked, as soon as she closed the door. Behind her, Margaret was already waiting, seated in an old armchair that had belonged to Emily's mother. "Your mother made me promise I would only speak about this in case of extreme necessity," Margaret began, her voice trembling slightly. "The week before the accident, she was very agitated. She spent several days organizing documents in the estate's office." Emily sat on the edge of the sofa, her wedding dress rustling softly. "What kind of documents?" "I'm not entirely sure, but she kept everything locked in an old chest." "A chest with a very particular lock?" Margaret glanced meaningfully at the bouquet Emily still held. With trembling hands, Emily retrieved the key. Under the brighter light of the room, she could see the details of the object more clearly. Besides the symbol her father used, there were small initials engraved at the base. MT, the same initials as her mother, Mary Thompson. "Your mother mentioned something about irregularities she had uncovered," Margaret continued, lowering her voice even further. "Something related to the family businesses. She was gathering evidence, but then—" A noise in the hallway made both of them jump. Footsteps were approaching. Emily quickly hid the key in the secret pocket she had sewn into her dress. A family tradition her mother always mentioned: a woman needs to have her own secrets. The door opened, and Edward, Alexander's brother, entered, slightly unsteady. His face was red, betraying the excess of champagne. "Emily, everyone is looking for you," he said, his voice louder than usual. Then, noticing Margaret, he frowned. "Sorry, I didn't know you were busy." "We were just finishing," Margaret replied softly, standing up. "I'll go check if everything is in order with dinner." When Margaret left, Edward closed the door and approached Emily. His expression had completely changed, the drunkenness replaced by a frightening seriousness. "You need to be careful," he whispered, glancing nervously at the door. "Don't trust anyone, not even my brother." "What are you talking about?" Emily asked, her heart racing. "Alexander started this with good intentions, I swear. Our company was sinking and your Uncle Albert offered a solution that seemed perfect. But things went too far." Before Emily could ask more, the door opened again. Albert entered, his cordial smile not completely hiding the irritation in his eyes. "There you are. The guests are waiting for the toast," he said, extending his hand to Emily. Then, noticing Edward, he added coldly, "I think your father is looking for you, Edward." Edward gave Emily one last meaningful look before leaving her alone with her uncle. Albert studied her for a moment, his eyes briefly lingering on the spot where her dress formed a small bulge, exactly where the key was hidden. "You seem different today," he commented, offering his arm to escort her back to the party. "Distant." "It's just wedding nerves," Emily replied, forcing a smile. "Of course," Albert nodded, but his tone suggested he wasn't convinced. "You know, I was thinking of speeding up the sale of the estate. We already have an interested buyer, and now that you're married—" Emily felt a chill run down her spine. Her uncle's sudden urgency to sell the property, along with Edward's warning and her mother's discoveries, painted an increasingly disturbing picture. Back in the hall, Alexander was waiting for her with a glass of champagne, his smile too tense. For someone who had just gotten married. Emily noticed when he exchanged a quick glance with Albert, a look that carried a weight of complicity she had never noticed before. The soft music and lively chatter of the guests contrasted dramatically with the storm brewing in her mind. Emily knew she had to act fast. Whatever her mother had discovered at the estate, it was clear that others were also interested in that information. Amid the congratulations and smiles, Emily made a decision. As soon as the reception was over, she would go to the estate. She needed to find out what was in that chest before it was too late. The distant bark of Max coming from the gardens sounded like a confirmation of her thoughts. The wedding reception stretched late into the night. When the last guest finally left, it was past midnight. Emily had played her role as the happy bride perfectly, dancing with Alexander, smiling for the photos, and thanking everyone for the gifts. But her mind was focused on one goal, getting to the estate. "You must be exhausted," Alexander commented when they were finally alone, wrapping her in a hug that seemed more hesitant than usual. "How about we postpone the honeymoon trip and rest here today?" The suggestion caught Emily by surprise. The original plan was to leave immediately after the party for a private island in the Caribbean, a trip meticulously planned by Albert. "Actually," she replied, choosing her words carefully, "I was thinking of spending a few days at the estate, you know, to say goodbye to the place before the sale." Alexander visibly paled. "I don't think that's a good idea. The place is abandoned and—" "Please," Emily interrupted, gently touching his face, "it would mean a lot to me. We could go right now, spend our first married night in the place where I had the best moments of my childhood." Before Alexander could protest again, Edward appeared in the hall, still unsteady but with surprisingly clear eyes. "Bro, I need your help with an urgent issue at the company," he said, giving his brother a meaningful look. "Now?" Alexander asked, clearly annoyed. "It's about that meeting with the Chinese investors," Edward insisted. "It can't wait until tomorrow." Emily saw her opportunity. "Go handle it, love. I'll head to the estate with Margaret, and you can meet me there later." Alexander hesitated, looking from Emily to Edward, then to Albert, who was watching the scene from a distance. After a tense moment, he nodded in defeat. "All right, but wait for me before exploring the place, okay? Like you said, it's abandoned. It could be dangerous." Emily agreed, knowing full well she wouldn't keep that promise. As soon as Alexander left with Edward, she rushed to change out of her wedding dress into more suitable clothes. Margaret was already waiting for her in the car, with a small emergency bag and flashlights. The trip to the estate took about 40 minutes. The property was in a remote area, surrounded by dense vegetation that made it almost invisible from the main road. When the car finally stopped in front of the rusted gate, Emily felt a shiver of anticipation. "Are you sure about this?" Margaret asked, her voice betraying concern. "Absolutely," Emily replied, pulling the key from her pocket. "But first, I need you to tell me everything you know about my mother's suspicions." Margaret sighed deeply. "Before beginning, your mother discovered some strange transfers in the company accounts, large amounts being diverted to offshore accounts. At first, she thought it was some accounting error, but the more she investigated—" A rustling sound from the bushes interrupted the conversation. Emily pointed the flashlight toward the noise, and to her surprise and relief, Max emerged from the shadows, wagging his tail. "You followed us here," she exclaimed, hugging the dog. Max barked softly, as if confirming, and began pulling Emily toward a side path that led to the back of the house. "He wants to show us something," Margaret observed, following them with the flashlight. The path led to an old greenhouse now covered in vines. Max stopped in front of a side door, nearly hidden by the vegetation. Emily gripped the key tightly, her heart racing as she recognized the place. It was where her father used to keep his most important documents. With trembling hands, she inserted the key into the lock. It fit perfectly. With a soft click, the door opened, revealing a dusty but surprisingly well-preserved room. In the center, partially covered by a tarp, was an old wooden chest. "My God," Margaret whispered, "it's exactly as your mother left it." Emily approached the chest, carefully removing the tarp. The same lock, with the same symbol as the key, awaited her. When she finally opened the chest, her breath caught in her throat. Inside were dozens of meticulously organized folders, each labeled with dates and codes that Emily recognized from her mother's filing system. On top, a sealed envelope with her name, written in Mary Thompson's elegant handwriting. But before she could open the envelope, headlights illuminated the entrance to the property. Someone had arrived. "Quick," Margaret whispered urgently, "take as much as you can. We can't let them find this." Emily stuffed as many documents as possible into her bag, including the envelope with her name. The sound of male voices approaching made her blood run cold. She immediately recognized the authoritative tone of her Uncle Albert. Max began to growl softly, positioning himself protectively in front of the two women. Through the dusty greenhouse window, Emily saw three figures approaching the main house carrying flashlights: her Uncle Alexander, Edward, and a man she didn't recognize. "Is there another way out?" Emily whispered to Margaret. The housekeeper nodded, pointing to a door at the back of the greenhouse. "It leads to the creek. We can circle around the property and reach the car without being seen." Emily hesitated just long enough to lock the trunk and stash the key. She left the tarp exactly as it was. Hopefully they wouldn't notice that someone had been there. With Max leading the way, the two women disappeared into the darkness of the night, carrying with them secrets that could change everything. The sun was beginning to rise when Emily, Margaret, and Max finally arrived at the safe apartment Margaret kept in the heart of Charleston, a small refuge the housekeeper had bought years ago with her savings. The place was simple but cozy, and most importantly, no one besides her daughter, who lived in Portugal, knew of its existence. "I need to call Alexander," Emily said after settling onto the living room couch. "He must be worried." "Wait," Margaret urged, placing a steaming cup of tea in front of Emily. "First, we need to see what's in these documents. Your mother wouldn't have kept all this without a good reason." Emily nodded, pulling the envelope with her name from her bag. Her hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal. Inside, she found a handwritten letter and several carefully labeled flash drives. "My dear daughter," she began to read aloud, her voice catching as she recognized her mother's elegant handwriting. "If you're reading this letter, it means you finally found the key, and with it, the truth your father and I tried to protect." Max lay down at her feet, as if sensing her distress. Emily took a deep breath and continued. "In recent months, we discovered serious irregularities within Thompson Enterprises. Your Uncle Albert, whom we trusted so much, has been diverting massive resources through a complex network of shell companies. But the worst part isn't the embezzlement, it's the reason behind it." Emily paused, her hands gripping the paper tightly. Margaret moved closer, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Albert found out about the social project your father and I were secretly developing. A network of support centers for underprivileged families, built using a portion of the company's profits. To him, this represented a threat to his plan of turning Thompson Enterprises into a profit-driven conglomerate. When we confronted Albert with the evidence, he..." The letter went on, revealing Albert's meticulous plan to take full control of the company. The arranged marriage to Alexander was just the final piece of the puzzle, a way to ensure that Emily, upon becoming Mrs. Montgomery, would transfer her shares to her husband's control. All the documents proving these actions are on the flash drives, along with the original plans for the support center. Emily, trust your instincts as you always have. And remember, Max was specially trained to protect these secrets. He knows more than we realize. Emily looked at the Labrador, who stared back at her with intelligent eyes. Now she understood why he had acted that way on the day of the wedding. He was fulfilling his final mission, assigned by her parents. "There's one more thing," Margaret said, picking up one of the flash drives. "Your mother made me memorize a password in case something happened. She said it was the key to accessing the most important files." As Margaret connected the flash drive to the laptop, Emily's phone began to ring. It was Alexander for the 10th time since they had left the estate. "I can't ignore him forever," Emily sighed. "He must be at the mansion now, waiting for me." "Emily," Margaret called, her voice urgent. "You need to see this." On the laptop screen, a series of documents began to open. Contracts, bank transfers, encrypted emails, all pointing to a scheme much larger than they had imagined. There were also photos. Albert in secret meetings with businessmen known for questionable practices. Alexander signing documents alongside men Emily recognized as private investigators. "He knew," Emily whispered, the pieces falling into place in her mind. Alexander knew everything from the beginning. As if responding to her revelation, her phone rang again. This time, it was a message from Edward. "I need to see you urgently." Alexander confessed everything. "I have something you need to know about the night of your parents' accident." Emily felt her blood run cold. Beside her, Max let out a low whine as if sharing her apprehension. "What are we going to do?" Margaret asked, closing the laptop. Emily stood up, a new determination in her eyes. "We're going to find Edward. But first we need to make backup copies of all this, and..." She hesitated, looking at her phone. "I think it's time to make a call to Helen Martinez." "The investigative journalist?" Margaret asked, surprised. "Exactly. If there's anyone who can help us expose all of this without Albert being able to cover it up, it's her. My parents always said the truth is like water. It finds its way no matter how many barriers are put in its path." The sun was already high in the sky when Emily finished making the necessary calls. In a few hours, she would meet Edward at a discreet cafe in the historic center of Charleston. Their official honeymoon had been cancelled due to a sudden illness of the bride, an excuse Albert certainly wouldn't believe for long. As she prepared to leave, Emily looked at her reflection in the mirror. She was still wearing the delicate choker her mother had worn at her own wedding. She touched the jewel gently, feeling closer to her parents than ever. "Let's do this the right way," she said to Max, who hadn't left her side. "It's time to honor the true legacy of the Thompson family." The Crystal Palace Cafe, in the heart of Charleston's historic center, was relatively empty that Sunday morning. Emily chose a discreet table at the back of the establishment, where she could observe the entrance without being easily seen. Max lay at her feet, alert as always. Helen Martinez was already on her way after hearing a brief summary of the situation. Over the phone, the journalist had investigated cases of corporate corruption for years and, coincidentally, had already been keeping an eye on the suspicious activities of Thompson Enterprises. "Your coffee, ma'am," the waiter said, placing the cup on the table. Emily thanked him with a tense smile, her eyes fixed on the door. Edward had scheduled the meeting for 9 a.m., and there were only 5 minutes left. Her phone vibrated. It was a message from Margaret. "Backup complete. Files sent to the secure address. Be careful." Before she could respond, Edward entered the cafe. He looked pale and disheveled, as if he hadn't slept. His eyes scanned the room until they found Emily, and he quickly walked over to her table. "You shouldn't have come alone," he said, sitting down. "I'm not alone," Emily replied, subtly gesturing to Max with a nod of her head. "And Helen Martinez is on her way." Edward turned even paler. "The journalist? Emily? You don't understand." "The danger." "Then make me understand," she interrupted, leaning forward. "What do you know about my parents?" Edward ran his hands over his face, seeming to age years in seconds. "It started with our company, Montgomery Holdings. We were on the brink of bankruptcy after a failed project. Albert showed up offering help, an investment that would save everything. The only condition was that that he would get close to you." Emily felt her stomach churn but kept her voice steady. "Go on." "At first, it was just to make sure you wouldn't interfere with the business when you took over your share of the company. But Alexander truly fell in love with you, Emily. That complicated everything. He started questioning Albert's plans, especially after he found out about..." A sudden movement at the entrance of the cafe caught both their attention. Alexander was standing at the door, his face a mask of anguish as he saw his brother with Emily. "Don't do this, Edward," he said, approaching the table. Max immediately stood up, a low growl escaping his throat. "She deserves to know the truth," Edward replied, standing up. "About everything, including that night on the road." "What night on the road?" Emily asked, her heart pounding irregularly. "Your parents' accident," Alexander said, his voice almost a whisper. "It wasn't an accident." Time seemed to freeze. Emily felt the air leave her lungs as the implications of those words hit her like a physical blow. "Albert found out that your parents were planning to expose the embezzlement," Edward continued, ignoring his brother's silent protests. "He hired people to make sure they never made it to that board meeting. Alexander found out later, when he was already too deep to get out." "And you stayed by my side all this time?" Emily asked Alexander, her voice trembling with suppressed anger. "You planned a wedding with me knowing this." "I tried to protect you," Alexander argued, taking a step toward her. Max positioned himself. Between them, his growl more intense now. "When I found out the truth, I tried to find a way to expose Albert without putting you at risk. But he has people everywhere, powerful connections. So you decided to marry me? That was your solution?" "It was the only way I could stay close, to try to fix things from the inside," Alexander said, running his hands through his hair in frustration. "But when I saw Max appear in the church with that key, I knew everything was about to fall apart." The sound of heels on the wooden floor announced the arrival of Helen Martinez. The journalist, an elegant woman in her 50s, approached the table with determined steps. "Mrs. Montgomery," she said, then corrected herself with an understanding smile. "Or should I say Miss Thompson?" "Emily, please," she replied, standing up. "Thank you for coming so quickly. When I received your message, I connected several dots from an investigation I've been conducting for months," Helen explained, sitting down. Her sharp eyes assessed Alexander and Edward. "I see we have interesting company." "They were about to tell me all the details of how my Uncle Albert orchestrated my parents' accident," Emily said, her voice laced with a dangerous calm. "And I believe we have much more to discuss." At that moment, Alexander's phone rang. He looked at the screen and paled. "It's Albert. He's on his way here." "Perfect," Helen smiled, pulling a small recorder from her bag. "The more, the better. Emily, are you ready for this?" Emily looked at Max, who maintained his protective stance, then at the documents in her bag. Her parents' last words, the evidence of a conspiracy that had cost so much. She thought of the support center they had dreamed of building, of the families that could have been helped. "I'm ready," she replied, straightening her shoulders. "It's time to rewrite the ending of this story." The sound of Albert's firm footsteps echoed through the cafe even before his imposing figure appeared at the entrance. Dressed in an impeccable suit, as always, he looked more like an executive on his way to a business meeting than a man about to face the destruction of his empire of lies. "What an interesting gathering," he commented, approaching the table with a cold smile. His eyes swept over each face present, lingering for a moment on Helen Martinez. "I didn't know the press had been invited to our family matters." "Sit down." "Uncle," Emily said, her voice steady, "we have a lot to talk about." Albert hesitated for a moment, then pulled out a chair. Max kept his eyes fixed on him, the fur on his neck bristling in silent alert. "Emily found the documents," Alexander said, breaking the tense silence. "We know everything." "Documents?" Albert laughed, but there was a visible tension in his shoulders. "What documents?" "The ones my mother kept at the estate," Emily replied, pulling a flash drive from her bag. "Including records of transfers to offshore accounts, fraudulent contracts, and—" She paused significantly. "The evidence of what really happened the night of the accident." Albert's smile faltered. "Your imagination has always been quite vivid, dear, just like your mother's." "Don't try to manipulate the situation, Albert," Helen interjected, her recorder discreetly capturing every word. "I've been investigating your operations for months. The scheme to divert funds through shell companies in Central America, the suspicious dealings with investment funds, the pattern of convenient accidents involving people who started asking too many questions." "Be careful with your words, Mrs. Martinez," Albert warned, his mask of cordiality beginning to crack. Defamation is a serious crime, as is corporate fraud and conspiracy, Edward added, his voice trembling slightly. I was there in several meetings, Albert. I know everything that was planned. Albert leaned back in his chair, studying each face around the table. And what exactly do you hope to achieve with this? Emily, you're a Montgomery now. Your place is by your husband's side, not listening to conspiracy theories. My place, Emily replied, her voice heavy with restrained emotion, is honoring my parents' legacy. The true legacy, not the twisted version you created. Your parents were foolish. Idealists, Albert sneered, his facade finally crumbling. They wanted to turn one of the country's largest companies into a charity. I saved the empire your family built. Saved? Emily leaned forward, her eyes blazing. You destroyed everything they believed in. You turned a company that helped people into a money-making machine at the expense of innocent lives. And you think you can change that? Albert laughed bitterly. With what authority your husband controls your actions now, have you forgotten? Actually, Alexander intervened, his voice surprisingly firm, the prenuptial agreement was never registered. Emily still maintains full control of her share in the company. Albert's face paled. What? I couldn't do it, Alexander continued, looking at Emily. I couldn't go through with the plan, not after discovering the whole truth. You sentimental coward, Albert snarled, standing up abruptly. You had one job. Max instantly rose to his feet, a low growl escaping his throat. Other cafe patrons began to watch the scene with interest. It's over, Albert, Helen declared, revealing her recorder. Every word of this conversation is being recorded. And that's not all. Right now, my team is receiving copies of all the documents Emily found. You can't prove anything, Albert said, but his voice had lost its usual confidence. I can prove everything, Emily replied, her voice trembling slightly, including that night. The men you hired, they weren't as careful as you thought. They left traces, Albert. And now, all those traces lead back to you. The sound of sirens began to echo in the distance, gradually growing closer. Edward had done his part, alerting the authorities at the agreed-upon moment. It's not over yet, Albert threatened, taking a step back. You have no idea how far my connections reach. No, Emily agreed, standing up. It's not over. But now it's the beginning of the end, and this time the truth won't stay buried. The sirens were closer now. Albert looked around like a cornered animal searching for an escape route. But Max blocked one side and Alexander the other. Helen continued recording, her calm smile revealing the confidence of someone who knew they had a bombshell story in hand. You have two choices, Emily said, her voice now carrying an authority that strongly resembled her mother's. You can try to run away and turn this into an even bigger scandal, or you can face the consequences of your actions with the little dignity you have left. The sound of car doors slamming outside announced the arrival of the authorities. Albert Thompson, the man who had manipulated so many lives for so long, finally realized that his empire of lies was about to crumble. The hours following the confrontation at the cafe passed like a whirlwind. Albert was taken in for questioning, while Emily, accompanied by Helen Martinez and her lawyers, formally presented all the evidence to the authorities. News of the scandal involving Thompson Enterprises began to spread rapidly, first in whispers through the halls of power, then in increasingly detailed headlines. That same afternoon, Emily was in the main office of the Thompson mansion, now practically empty after the investigators' visit. Max slept near the door, finally allowing himself to relax after days of constant tension. The documents your mother kept are impressive, Helen commented, organizing her notes. She documented absolutely everything. She knew that one day the truth would have to come out. My mother always said that the truth is like a seed, Emily replied, running her fingers over the old mahogany desk. It can lie dormant for a long time, but when it finds the right soil, nothing can stop its growth. Margaret entered the office carrying a tray with tea and cookies. Her eyes were red from crying, but there was a smile of relief on her face. The police just called, she informed. They found the documents Albert tried to destroy at the estate and... She hesitated, looking at Emily. Alexander is outside. He wants to talk to you. Emily sighed deeply. After the confrontation at the cafe, Alexander had voluntarily accompanied the authorities to give his statement. Now, hours later, she still wasn't sure how she felt about him. "Do you want me to ask him to leave?" Margaret asked gently. "No," Emily replied after a moment. "I think we need to have this conversation." Alexander entered the office looking years older than he had the previous morning at the wedding. His eyes were marked by deep bags, and his normally confident posture had given way to an almost painful hesitation. "Emily," he began, "I know that nothing I say can fix what happened, but I need you to know the whole truth." "Sit down," she indicated the chair in front of her. Helen discreetly began to rise, but Emily gestured for her to stay. "Anything you have to say can be said in front of her." Alexander nodded, sitting down. "When Albert came to us, Montgomery Holdings was on the brink of bankruptcy. He offered not just investment, but a partnership that would save my family's legacy. The only condition was that I get close to you, ensure that you wouldn't interfere with the business when you took over your share of the company." "And the plan was to manipulate me from the start?" Emily asked, her voice controlled. "At first, yes," he admitted, his face twisted with shame. "But then I truly fell in love with you. And the more I got to know you, the harder it became to keep up that charade." "When did you find out about my parents?" Alexander closed his eyes for a moment. 3 months before the wedding. I overheard a conversation between Albert and one of his contacts. He was boasting about how he had solved the problem of the idealists who wanted to turn the company into a charity institution. "And yet you went through with the wedding," Helen interjected, her voice filled with disbelief. "I had a plan," Alexander explained, his voice breaking. "I was gathering evidence, building a solid case against Albert, but I needed time. I needed to be sure I could protect Emily when everything came to light." "You had no right to make that decision for me," Emily said, standing up. "Every day you spent by my side knowing the truth was another day of lies." "I know," he replied, also standing, "and I'll carry that guilt for the rest of my life. That's why I came here. Not to ask for forgiveness, but to give you this." He pulled an envelope from the inside pocket of his jacket. "It's the annulment of our marriage, already signed by me, and also a document relinquishing any rights to the company shares that would have been transferred to me." Emily took the envelope with slightly trembling hands. "Why?" "Because you deserve the chance to rebuild your parents' legacy in your own way, without any shadows from the past. And because—" he hesitated. "Because loving someone means wanting the best for them, even if it means letting them go." A heavy silence fell over the office, broken only by the soft sound of Max's breathing, who had woken up and was watching the scene intently. "What will you do now?" Emily finally asked. "I will face the consequences of my actions," Alexander replied. "Cooperate with the investigations, try to fix what can be fixed. Edward and I are going to restructure Montgomery Holdings, try to restore the company's reputation the right way this time." Helen made some notes in her notebook. "What about the social project Emily's parents had planned?" A small smile appeared on Emily's face for the first time that day. "It's going to happen. It was their dream to turn the estate into a support center for underprivileged families, and now finally I can make that dream come true." "Emily," Alexander called, already near the door, "there's one last thing you need to know. About Max. What about him? Your father had a special code with him, a command that was only to be used in extreme emergencies. On that last night, your father must have given that command. That's why Max protected those documents all these years, waiting for the right moment to guide you to them." Emily looked at the Labrador, who was now by her side, as always. So many years keeping secrets, protecting the truth, waiting for the right moment to reveal it. Her eyes filled with tears as she bent down to hug her loyal companion. "Thank you for telling me that," she said to Alexander, her voice soft. He nodded one last time and left, leaving behind not just the office, but also the final chapter of a story that had begun with lies, but now had the chance for a fresh start. A week after the confrontation at the cafe, the Thompson mansion pulsed with a different energy. What was once a symbol of power and opulence was now transforming into a planning hub for the future. Emily had converted the dining room into an improvised meeting space where various professionals took turns presenting projects and ideas. "The architects have finished the preliminary study for the estate renovation," Margaret announced, entering the room with a folder of documents. "They managed to incorporate almost all of your parents' original ideas into the project." Emily smiled, looking at the blueprints spread across the table. The old mansion would be transformed into a social support complex, with areas dedicated to medical care, legal assistance, vocational education, and, of course, a special space for animal-assisted therapy, a tribute to Max. "Your mother would be proud," Helen commented, taking notes for her series of reports on the transformation of Thompson Enterprises. "She always said that true legacies are built with purpose, not just profit." "I found something else," Margaret said, pulling a yellowed envelope from her folder. "It was hidden in a secret compartment in the library. They are old photos from the early days of the company." Emily carefully picked up the photographs. In the black and white images, her grandfather stood alongside employees back when the company was much smaller, but already showed its social vocation. In one of the photos, an elderly woman smiled in front of a small clinic, the first social project of the Thompson family. "Mrs. Matilda," Margaret explained, noticing Emily's interest in the photo. "Your grandmother turned part of the company's first office into a care center for employees and their families. That's how it all began." The sound of footsteps caught the group's attention. Edward entered the room carrying his laptop. After the scandal, he had become an important ally, helping to unravel all the branches of Albert's schemes. "Emily, you need to see this," he said, opening the laptop. "We found more documents on the company's old servers. Your father had left a detailed plan for expanding the social projects. He envisioned creating a network of support centers in several cities." "And why was it never put into action?" Helen asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Albert," Edward replied, confirming her suspicion. "He altered all the reports, redirected the funds meant for those projects to his offshore accounts. But the most interesting part is this." He showed a series of old emails exchanged between Emily's parents and various business people. They weren't alone. There was an entire group of business people willing to join the initiative, forming a mutual support network for social projects. Emily felt her heart race. "And these business people, are they still—" "Most of them are still around," Edward finished, smiling. "And when they found out you're reviving the original project, several have already expressed interest in renewing the partnership." Max, who had been dozing in his usual spot by the window, suddenly stood up, wagging his tail. Seconds later, the doorbell rang. "That must be the Animal Protection Center team," Margaret said, checking her schedule. "They're here to discuss the partnership for the assisted therapy program." "Perfect," Emily replied, organizing the documents on the table. "We need to define how the rehabilitation sector with rescued animals will work." As Margaret left to greet the visitors, Emily picked up her phone to check the latest updates on the case. The news was still making waves. Albert Thompson confesses to embezzlement scheme. Thompson Enterprises announces new phase focused on social responsibility. Heiress revives social project envisioned by her parents. "Have you decided about the chairmanship of the board?" Helen asked, watching Emily with curiosity. "Yes," she replied, a confident smile on her face. "I will take it on personally, but with one condition. The board will be mostly composed of people directly involved with social projects. We need different perspectives, people who truly understand the needs of the communities we want to help." "What about Montgomery Holdings?" "Alexander and Edward are restructuring the company, focusing on social housing projects and the revitalization of degraded areas." Ironic, isn't it? What Albert feared the most, getting closer to social projects, ended up becoming the path to their company's salvation. The room began to fill with new visitors, professionals specialized in animal-assisted therapy, veterinarians and social educators, all bringing ideas and proposals for the new center. Max moved around the guests, sniffing each new face as if conducting his own assessment of the future partners. His behavior drew smiles from the visitors, especially when he stopped and sat beside someone, as if giving his personal approval. "You know," Helen commented discreetly to Emily, "your story is going to inspire a lot of people. A young businesswoman, turning a family tragedy into a project of hope for so many. It's not my story, Emily gently corrected. It's my parents' story. My family's. I'm just putting things back on their natural course. She paused, watching Max interact with a child who had accompanied one of the visitors. And of course, with the best help possible, the day progressed with meetings and planning, each new agreement and partnership bringing the dream closer to reality. The mansion, which for so long had been a symbol of Albert's power and greed, was gradually transforming into a center of hope and change. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit like. Tell us which city you're watching from, and stay tuned. 3 months had passed since the revelation of Albert's scheme. The Thompsons' estate, once abandoned, now buzzed with the sound of construction and lively voices. The renovation project was in full swing, turning the family's old refuge into the first Mariana and Robert Thompson Integrated Social Support Center in honor of Emily's parents. On that sunny spring morning, Emily walked through the construction site alongside Helen Martinez, who was covering the transformation for a special series of reports. Max accompanied them, overseeing every detail as if he were the chief engineer of the project. It's incredible how much has changed in such a short time, Helen commented, photographing the partially restored facade. When did you imagine that wedding would lead to all this? Emily smiled, adjusting the mandatory safety goggles on the site. Sometimes I think my parents in some way planned all of this. The key, the documents, even Max's special training. It was as if they knew that one day I would need to uncover the truth. They arrived at the area that would become the future center for animal-assisted therapy. Several kennels were already ready, built following the most modern standards of animal welfare. A team of veterinarians and trainers had already been hired, and the first rescued animals would begin arriving the following week. "Emily!" Margaret called, approaching with a clipboard in hand. "The first class for the professional training course is already full. We have over 50 people signed up for the computer and entrepreneurship classes. And the partnerships with local businesses? Better than we expected. 15 companies have already committed to offering internships and job positions for the graduates of our courses." Emily's phone vibrated. It was a message from Edward. Montgomery Holdings had just approved the construction project for a low-income housing complex, the first of many planned in partnership with the support center. "Alexander was here yesterday," Margaret commented casually, observing Emily's reaction. "I know," Emily replied softly. "He came to present the project for expanding the center to other cities. The idea is to replicate this model, creating an integrated support network." Helen made some notes in her notebook. "And how has it been working with him after everything?" "Different," Emily admitted, "but I think we've finally found a balance. He's genuinely committed to making amends, to using Montgomery's resources to make a difference." They arrived at her father's old office, now transformed into a modern meeting room. On the walls, alongside the historical family photos, there was now a large mural displaying the complete project of the center and its future expansions. "Your father had a framed quote here," Margaret recalled, touching one of the walls, something about building bridges. "Businesses build fortunes, but bridges between people build futures," Emily quoted, smiling at the memory. "He always said that during board meetings, especially when Albert argued against social investments." Max barked softly, drawing the group's attention to the window. Outside, a group of children from the neighboring community watched the construction, work curiously, their faces pressed against the fence. "Why don't we give them a tour?" Emily suggested, already heading toward the door. "After all, this place will be theirs too." As they walked toward the gate, Helen observed, "You know your story is inspiring other companies, don't you? 3 major corporations have already announced the creation of their own social programs since we started publishing the series of reports." "It's funny," Emily replied, watching Max run ahead to greet the children. "Albert always said that mixing business with social projects would destroy the company. But look at us. We're stronger than ever, precisely because we rediscovered the true purpose behind it all." One of the children, a girl about 10 years old, timidly approached Max, who sat patiently, allowing her to pet him. "What's his name?" the girl asked. "Max," Emily answered, crouching beside her. He's our guardian. He's the one who helped us transform this place into what it's becoming. And what will this be? Emily smiled, looking around. At the ongoing construction, the dedicated professionals, the future taking shape before her eyes. This will be a place for new beginnings, she replied. A place where dreams can grow and people can transform. Want to see? The girl nodded enthusiastically, and soon the entire group of children joined them for an impromptu tour of the construction site. Max led the way, as always, now a guardian not just of secrets, but of hopes and fresh starts. 6 months after the construction began, the Mary and Robert Thompson Integrated Social Support Center held its official inauguration ceremony. The old mansion of the estate, now fully restored, gleamed under the morning sun. Hundreds of people gathered in the meticulously maintained gardens where Max had once found the key that changed everything. "I've never seen so many people." "Here," Margaret commented, emotional, arranging the last chairs for the ceremony. Not even in the family's golden days. Emily watched the activity from her old playroom, now transformed into a cozy office. Max was by her side, as always, his golden fur reflecting the light streaming through the window. On the desk, a photo of her parents smiled back at her, while on the walls newspaper clippings told the story of Thompson Enterprises' transformation. Miss Emily, called Sophia, one of the first beneficiaries of the professional training program. The representatives from the other partner companies have arrived. Sophia, who had once worked as a housekeeper, had graduated from the first class of the administration course offered by the center. Now she was one of the administrative coordinators, a living example of the impact the project was already having. "Thank you, Sophia. I'll be right down." In the main hall, business leaders, politicians, and representatives from social organizations chatted animatedly. Edward was there representing Montgomery Holdings, which had become one of the project's main partners. Beside him, Helen Martinez spoke with a group of journalists preparing the special coverage of the inauguration. "Emily," Edward waved, approaching with a genuine smile. "I just received confirmation. 3 more companies want to implement similar projects in their regions. Your model is becoming a national benchmark." "Our model," she gently corrected. "Every person in this project has contributed to its success." A commotion at the entrance caught everyone's attention. Alexander Montgomery had arrived, accompanied by a team of architects. Over the past few months, he had dedicated himself entirely to the expansion project of the support centers, turning his experience in civil construction into a tool for social good. "The plans for the new centers in Millionaire'S are ready," he announced, approaching the group with a folder of documents. "The city councils have already approved the blueprints, and construction can begin next month." Emily noticed that, despite the professionalism among them, the initial tension had given way to mutual respect. The wounds of the past were beginning to heal, transformed by the greater purpose that now united them. "Excuse me," Margaret interrupted softly. "It's time." Emily nodded, making her way to the small stage set up in the gardens. Max followed, her sitting majestically beside the podium, as if he knew exactly his role in this historic moment. "A year ago," Emily began, her voice clear and firm, "this place held secrets and sorrows. Today it holds hopes and dreams. In 6 months of partial operation, our center has already impacted over 500 families. We've graduated 3 professional training classes. Our clinic has provided over 1,000 consultations, and our animal-assisted therapy program is already transforming lives." She paused, looking at the attentive faces in the audience. She saw Mrs. Mildred, a 70-year-old woman who had learned to read in the center's literacy classes. She saw John, a former homeless man who now worked as a maintenance assistant. She saw children who attended the daycare, mothers who participated in entrepreneurship programs, and young people who had found a new direction through vocational courses. "But we're not here just to celebrate numbers," she continued. "We're here to celebrate transformations. Every life changed, every dream realized, every smile restored is proof that my parents were right. Companies aren't made just of financial statements. They're made of people, of purpose, of social responsibility." Max barked softly, as if approving every word. In the audience, some eyes filled with tears. The Mary and Robert Thompson Center is not just a social project. It's a movement of transformation that began long ago, was interrupted by greed, but has been reborn through love and truth. Every person here is part of this story of rebirth. Emily then invited Sophia to the stage, along with other beneficiaries of the program, to share their stories. Each testimony was a confirmation that her parents' dream had not only survived, but was growing beyond their original expectations. As she listened to those stories of overcoming, Emily felt a deep sense of peace. There, in that very place where the truth had been buried for so long, something much greater than a social project was being born. A new way of doing business, of building futures, of transforming lives. Max, always attentive, rested his head on Emily's lap, just as he used to do when she was a child. His wise gaze seemed to say that his mission was complete, but that he would remain there, no longer a guardian of secrets, but of dreams and hopes. The first anniversary of the support center coincided with the inauguration of the second unit, this time on the outskirts of Charleston. Emily watched through the window of her office in the Thompson mansion, now the administrative headquarters of the foundation, as photos of the new unit arrived on her tablet. Max slept peacefully in his special bed, his fur beginning to show the first signs of aging. Enrollment for the courses at the new unit has already exceeded all expectations, Margaret informed, entering the room with her usual folder of reports. And we've had to open extra classes in all programs. And how is the partnership with local businesses going? Emily asked, turning her attention to the housekeeper, who now officially held the position of General Operations Coordinator for the E Foundation. Surprising? Montgomery Holdings is leading a consortium of companies to ensure the employability of graduates. Alexander personally supervised the adaptation of the program to meet the needs of the local market. Emily smiled, picking up an old photo on her desk. Her parents, young and smiling, in front of the first headquarters of Thompson Enterprises. They always said that a company is only truly successful when it grows alongside its community. The sound of heels in the hallway announced the arrival of Helen Martinez. The journalist, who had become a close friend and advisor, brought important news. The National Social Responsibility Award has just been announced, she announced, unable to contain her excitement. The Mary and Robert Thompson Center won in 3 categories: Best Corporate Social Project, Innovation in Social Impact, and Community Transformation. And that's not all, Edward added, entering right behind her. The management model we developed is being studied by universities. 3 major corporations have already approached us, wanting to implement similar programs. Emily stood up, walking to the large window that overlooked the mansion's gardens. Down below, a group of children was participating in a therapy session with the center's trained dogs, a program that had been inspired by Max. "You know what's most impressive?" she commented, watching the children. "How something that started with a key found by a loyal dog turned into all of this." Max, as if understanding they were talking about him, lifted his head and lazily wagged his tail. "Actually," Margaret said, "it started much earlier. It started with your parents' dream of using the power of business to transform lives. The key just helped us rediscover that dream." The phone rang. It was Sophia, now manager of the center's first unit, with more news. One of the students from the entrepreneurship course had secured funding to open her own clothing workshop, which would employ other women from the community. "Emily," Helen called after the call ended, "there's something you need to see." She opened her folder and pulled out a newspaper. The special report on the first year of the center came out today. The headline was striking: "From Scandal to Redemption. How Thompson Enterprises Revolutionized Corporate Social Responsibility." The article spanned 2 full pages, featuring photos of the projects, testimonials from beneficiaries, and a detailed analysis of the social impact achieved. But the most interesting part is here. Helen pointed to a small box at the end of the article. It was an anonymous letter from one of the inmates at the prison where Albert was serving his sentence. In it, the former executive admitted that, upon seeing the news about the transformation of the companies, he finally understood the true meaning of business success. Sometimes, Emily reflected, We need to lose everything to find what truly matters. At that moment, Alexander walked into the room carrying blueprints and plans. After months of working together on the expansion project, he and Emily had found a professional balance that allowed both to contribute their best skills to the foundation's growth. The sites for the next 3 units have already been selected, he announced. They are strategic areas with high demand for social projects. And the funding? Edward asked. It won't be a problem, Emily replied. Thomson Enterprises' new social investment policy guarantees a fixed percentage of profits for the expansion of the centers. Plus, other companies are contributing through the fund we created. Max got up from his bed and walked over to Emily, resting his head on her leg as he always did. His eyes, though older, still held the same intelligence and loyalty as ever. You know, Emily said, stroking Max's head, I think I finally understand why my parents chose this special boy to be our guardian. They knew that one day we would need someone to remind us that the true value of things isn't in what we possess, but in what we can do for others. The room fell silent for a moment, each person reflecting on the journey that had brought them there. Outside, the sound of children laughing as they played with therapy dogs rose to the window, a living testament that dreams, when fueled by love and purpose, have the power to transform not just lives, but entire generations. On a fall morning, 2 years after the opening of the first support center, Emily found herself back at the family's old estate. The place, now completely transformed, pulsed with a vibrant energy that not even her most optimistic dreams had foreseen. 5,000, Margaret said, placing the annual report on Emily's desk. That's the number of families directly impacted by our programs at this unit alone. Emily smiled, watching the activity in the courtyard through the window. A group of teenagers was leaving a coding class, while another arrived for a social entrepreneurship course. In the therapeutic garden, Max supervised an assisted therapy session, his movements slower now, but his dedication unwavering. Miss Emily, Sophia called from the door, the TV crew is ready for the interview about the microcredit program. The new project, developed in partnership with several financial institutions, had already helped hundreds of small entrepreneurs achieve their dreams. It was another piece of the puzzle her parents had started putting together so many years ago. Helen called earlier, Margaret commented as they walked toward the makeshift studio. The book about the history of the center will be released next month. She said the chapter about Max is especially thrilling. Emily paused for a moment, watching her loyal companion who, despite his advanced age, never failed to fulfill his mission. He's the true hero of this story, isn't he? Everyone here is a hero, a familiar voice replied. It was Alexander, arriving for another board meeting. Every person who walked through these doors over the past 2 years helped build something extraordinary. The relationship between them had evolved into a partnership based on mutual respect and dedication to the cause. Montgomery Holdings, under the leadership of Alexander and Edward, had become a benchmark for affordable housing construction and urban revitalization projects. The numbers from the latest impact survey are in, Edward announced, joining the group with his ever-present tablet. 92% of participants in our programs report significant improvements in their quality of life, and 85% of our partner companies want to expand their involvement in the projects. The interview flowed naturally, with Emily sharing not only the practical results of the microcredit program, but also the human stories behind the numbers, like that of Judith, who turned her small snack business into a network of community restaurants, or Joseph, who created a recycling cooperative that employed former homeless individuals. After the interview, Emily found a moment of quiet in her office. Max lay at her feet, as he always did. On the wall, a new photograph had joined the collection of family memories, the image of the first graduation from the vocational training courses, with dozens of smiling faces celebrating new beginnings. Sometimes I wonder if they ever imagined it would go this far, Emily remarked to Margaret, who had quietly entered the room. Your parents always knew your potential, the housekeeper replied, her eyes shining with maternal affection. That's why they left everything prepared, trusting that one day you would find the right path. The sound of children's laughter drifted into the office through the open window. In the garden, a new group of children was participating in an activity with the therapy dogs. Max raised his head, his ears perked at the familiar sound. "You know what's most amazing?" Emily reflected, watching the scene. "How every challenge, every obstacle we faced, ended up leading us exactly where we needed to be." Margaret nodded, deeply understanding the meaning of those words. "Your mother always said there are no coincidences, only encounters destined by fate." The phone rang. It was the coordinator of the new unit in Salvador, bringing exciting news about the partnership with a local artisans cooperative. More lives being transformed, more dreams taking flight. As Emily answered the call, Max slowly got up and walked to the window, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the sun was beginning to set. It was as if he knew that his most important mission, guiding Emily to the truth and helping her rebuild her family's legacy, was finally complete. But the story was far from over. Each new day brought new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference. The support center had become much more than a social project. It was a movement of transformation that was growing and multiplying, touching more and more lives. "Emily," Margaret called softly after she hung up the phone. "I found something else in the old files." She handed over a yellowed envelope, bearing the elegant handwriting of Mary Thompson. It was a letter that had never been delivered, dated just a few days before the accident. In it, her mother spoke of her dreams for the future, about how she believed that one day Thompson Enterprises would become an example of how businesses can be a force for social transformation. "She knew," Emily whispered, tears blurring her vision. Even in those difficult moments, she knew that one day we would get here. The celebration of the support center's 3rd anniversary coincided with a special moment, the inauguration of the network's 10th unit, this time in a small town in the interior of Minas Gerais. The expansion of the project had exceeded all expectations, creating a true network of social transformation that spread across the country. That special morning, Emily woke up early, as usual. Max, now a dignified gentleman with white fur on, his muzzle, accompanied her to the mansion's porch where they usually started the day by watching the sunrise. "Good morning," Margaret appeared with 2 cups of coffee. "Helen just called. The response to the documentary about the center has been incredible. Several international companies have expressed interest in replicating the model." Emily smiled, remembering how it all began, with a mysterious key and a loyal dog who never gave up on his mission. Who would have thought we'd come this far? The day would be special, not only because of the anniversary celebration, but also because of the launch of a new project, the Thompson Institute for Corporate Social Responsibility Training. The initiative aimed to share the accumulated experience, training a new generation of managers committed to social impact. "The first applicants have already started arriving," Sophia announced, consulting her tablet. "We have executives from 5 different countries interested in the training program." The mansion's main hall, now the Institute's headquarters, was filled with photographs that told the story of transformation. On a special wall, there was a mural dedicated to the guardians of change, people who had been crucial in the journey of rebuilding the Thompson legacy. "Emily," Edward called, rushing in. "You need to see this." He showed a news report on his phone. Albert had written an open letter from prison, acknowledging his mistakes and encouraging other business leaders to rethink their practices. The letter ended with a plea for forgiveness, not only to the Thompson family, but also to all the people who could have benefited from the social projects he tried to destroy. People can change, Emily reflected, when they find a purpose greater than themselves. Alexander arrived shortly after, bringing the blueprints for the next housing projects. Montgomery Holdings had become a leader in sustainable construction and social urbanization projects, proving that it was possible to combine business success with social responsibility. "I have a surprise," he announced, handing Emily a folder. "We found your father's original plans for the international expansion of the social program, and I think the time has finally come to make them happen." Marina opened the folder carefully. The drawings and notes made by her father so many years ago seemed more relevant than ever. His vision of a global network of support centers, connecting communities and transforming lives, was finally within reach. "There's something else," Margaret said, handing an envelope to Marina. The latest class from the professional training program prepared something special. Inside the envelope were dozens of letters, each telling a story of transformation. People who had found hope, dignity, and opportunities through the center's programs. Lives that had been touched by the dream her parents had planted so many years ago. Max, who had been watching everything with his wise eyes, stood up and walked over to Marina, resting his head on her knee, as he always did during important moments. She bent down to hug him, feeling the emotion overwhelm her heart. "You know what this means, don't you, boy?" she whispered to her faithful companion. "We did it. We realized their dream and created something even greater." The main hall was beginning to fill with guests for the ceremony. Executives, program beneficiaries, partners, and supporters, all there to celebrate not just an anniversary, but a movement of transformation that had started with a simple key and grown beyond all expectations. Helen Martinez, who had documented every step of this journey, approached with her recorder, ready for another historic interview. Marina looked around, at Margaret, who had become so much more than a housekeeper, at Alexander and Edward, who had proven that remorse and redemption were possible, at Sophia and so many others who had found their way through the center, and at Max, her faithful guardian, who had never stopped believing. "You know, Helen," she replied, "I think I finally understand something my parents always tried to teach me. True success isn't measured by what we achieve for ourselves, but by what we leave for others." In the garden, a new generation of children played with the therapy dogs, their laughter echoing across the property. The afternoon sun cast a golden light over the scene, like a silent blessing over everything that had been built and everything yet to come. 5 years had passed since that wedding day, when Max had brought the key that would change everything. The Mary and Robert Thompson Support Center network now had 15 units across the United States and 3 internationally, the first of which had recently opened in Portugal, the family's homeland. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, Marina walked through the gardens of the original estate, now a true park of hope and transformation. Max, slower but still majestic at 12 years old, faithfully accompanied her. His fur, now streaked with white, glowed in the setting sun. "I thought I'd find you here," Margaret said, approaching with an envelope in her hands. The first graduating class organized something special. It was a photo album, documenting the transformation not only of the physical space, but of the lives that had been touched by the project. Each page told a story of overcoming, of dreams realized, of futures rebuilt. "Look at this one," Margaret pointed to a particular photo. It was Sophia, on the day of her college graduation in business administration. Now she coordinated 3 units of the center and had become a sought-after speaker at social entrepreneurship events. Emily smiled, remembering how it all began. "You know, Lou, sometimes I wonder if my parents had any idea how big all of this would become." "They knew you'd find your way," a familiar voice replied. It was Helen Martinez, approaching with her ever-present notebook. "And speaking of which, I brought a surprise." The journalist handed over a flash drive. "I found it while researching for the new book. It's an old recording, an interview I did with your mother a few months before she passed." Emily felt her heart race. Max, sensing her emotion, rested his head on her leg, offering his silent support as he always did. In the video, Mary Thompson spoke about her dreams for the future of Thompson Enterprises. "Businesses are like seeds," she said, her eyes shining. With the same passion Emily had inherited. They can be planted solely for profit, or they can be cultivated to nurture dreams and transform lives. She was right, a new voice chimed in. Alexander had arrived, carrying the blueprints for the latest project, a social innovation center to be built in partnership with public universities. The relationship between Emily and Alexander had transformed over the years. Forgiveness, built gradually through shared work and a mutual commitment to social causes, had given way to mutual respect and a genuine friendship. Applications for the next cycle of the Institute have hit a record high. Edward informed, joining the group. Entrepreneurs from all over the world want to learn how to replicate our social management model. The sound of children's laughter filled the air. In the therapeutic playground, a group of children played with the new dogs from the program, all trained following the legacy of Max, who had become a living legend and inspiration for the assisted therapy project. "Emily," Margaret called softly, "there's one more thing." She handed over a small package. "We found this in your father's old desk." Inside was a diary, its pages yellowed with time. On the first page, a message, "To my daughter, when she discovers her true treasure." With slightly trembling hands, Emily began to read. "Dear daughter, if you're reading this, it means you found your way back to what truly matters. A family's true treasure isn't in its possessions or power, but in the legacy of love and transformation we leave for the world." Max let out a soft bark, as if approving every word. His eyes, though wearier with age, still shone with the same loyalty and wisdom as always. "Your parents would be so proud," Helen remarked, her eyes glistening. Emily hugged Max, feeling the emotion overflow in her chest. "They're here," she said, looking around. "In every smile, in every dream fulfilled, in every life transformed." The sun set on the horizon, painting the sky with shades of pink and gold. In the old mansion, now a beacon of hope and transformation, the lights began to flicker on. Soon another night class would begin, another opportunity for change, another chapter in the endless story of renewal and hope. "You know what's most amazing," Emily reflected, watching the movement of people arriving for the evening activities. "How a simple key can open not just doors, but hearts and infinite possibilities." Max wagged his tail as if in agreement. His mission, started so many years ago by Robert and Mary Thompson, had been fulfilled beyond all expectations. The legacy of love, transformation, and social responsibility they had dreamed of not only survived, but flourished, becoming a beacon of hope for future generations. "Come on, boy," Emily called affectionately. "We still have a lot of work ahead." And so, under the twilight sky, guardian and protector walked side by side, their shadows cast on the ground as a silent reminder that the greatest stories of transformation begin with a simple act of love and courage. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Let us know which city you're watching from, and we'll continue.